The outsider's invitation. The city of Tesseract shimmered beneath a sky that was not quite black, not quite silver, a luminous haze where distant moons flickered like the slow pulse of alien fireflies. Beneath its gleaming domes and gravity-defying walkways, the Tesserans moved in perfect harmony, their steps measured, their voices low and melodic, as though the entire civilization had agreed to exist in a state of perpetual choreography. Ira stood in the middle of it all, her long ears twitching at the whispers she pretended not to hear. She knew what they were saying, the same thing they always said. Reckless, improper, disruptive. She had been called worse. Her golden eyes flicked across the vast chamber, scanning the assembly of Tesseran dignitaries, social elites, and the occasional interstellar guests. The Grand Hall of Tesseract was a masterpiece of glass and energy, translucent floors revealing the city's layers beneath, walls shimmering with moving constellations. It was a place of quiet elegance, a sacred space where Tesseran rituals unfolded with the grace of celestial mechanics. And tonight the dance would begin. The first notes of the ceremonial overture rippled through the chamber, a sound more felt than heard, resonating through the bones. Tesseran couples began their movements, gliding effortlessly into synchrony, each step preordained by centuries of tradition. It was mesmerizing, a perfect display of unity. It was also, Ira thought, profoundly dull. She didn't want synchronization. She wanted something unpredictable, which was why, when the time came for the next partner sequence, she did the unthinkable. She extended her hand. The room fell into an unnatural stillness. Not a single Tesseran took her invitation. No one even pretended to consider it. Ira was not surprised, but that didn't make the rejection sting any less. Tesserans did not ask for partners, partners were assigned. Dance was not an invitation, it was an obligation, a structured progression of pre-approved gestures, and yet she had dared to break formation. Again. She sighed, lowering her arm, resigned to yet another evening of isolation. That was when she saw him. At first, she thought he might be some sort of experimental hologram, perhaps an unusually well-rendered diplomatic projection. But no, he was real, human. The man stood at the periphery of the hall, clearly an outsider both by biology and by demeanor. Where the Tesserans carried themselves with serene grace, this man slouched slightly, hands shoved into the pockets of a somewhat wrinkled formal uniform. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as though gravity had only a loose agreement with it. His eyes were sharp but amused, taking in the scene with the expression of someone who had wandered into an art gallery expecting paintings, but had instead found a room full of sentient statues. His gaze met hers. Ira hesitated. She had never interacted with a human before. They were unpredictable, illogical, sometimes clumsy, qualities the Tesserans found distasteful. And yet they were also known for their spontaneity. She took a step forward, pulse quickening, perhaps, just perhaps. But no, it was absurd. Even a human wouldn't be foolish enough to. And then he grinned. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying a casual warmth that was entirely out of place in the pristine hall. "You look like you could use a dance partner." Ira blinked. Had he just? Around them, horrified gasps rippled through the Tesseran elite. Someone nearly dropped their ceremonial flute. The human, completely oblivious to the scandal he had just unleashed, extended his hand in return. "I should warn you," he added. "I once stepped on an ambassador's foot at a diplomatic gala, and that was just walking across the room. If you value your toes, you might want to reconsider." Ira stared at him. This man was either the bravest or most clueless being in the galaxy, possibly both. She placed her hand in his. The music swelled again, hesitant, uncertain. The gathered Tesserans stood frozen in disbelief, watching as Ira and the human, Commander Nikolai, she learned his name, stepped into the center of the chamber. Nikolai's grip was warm, his posture relaxed but attentive. "So what's the worst that could happen?" he murmured as they moved into the first steps. "We could be exiled, shunned, and declared an abomination to my people's way of life," Ira replied, keeping her tone perfectly neutral. Nikolai nodded solemnly. "Neat, let's make it worth it then." Ira exhaled sharply. Was that humor? It had been so long since she had encountered it in earnest. But then there was no time for thought. The music dictated movement, and they danced. The Tessaran style was fluid, almost gravity-defying, a series of interwoven arcs and spirals meant to emulate the motion of celestial bodies. Nikolai, to his credit, adapted quickly. His movements lacked the precision of a native dancer, but he followed Ira's lead with surprising agility. And unlike the others, he wasn't afraid to improvise. As the dance progressed, Ira found herself smiling, a real unguarded smile. And then Nikolai spun her. It was not a Tessaran spin. Tessaran spins were calculated, deliberate. This was a human spin, fast and unexpected. Ira let out a startled laugh as momentum carried her in an exhilarating arc, her feet barely brushing the luminous floor before she landed gracefully back into his arms. The hall had gone completely silent. Ira turned her head just enough to see the expressions of her people. Shock, outrage, a few fanning themselves as though they might faint from sheer impropriety. Nikolai leaned in slightly. "I don't think they approve," he whispered. Ira glanced at him, her amusement growing. What gave it away? The murder stares. That, and the guy in the back looking like he just swallowed a space urchin. Ira chuckled, a real, genuine chuckle. It felt good. But she knew this moment of joy would not last. Even as the dance came to its conclusion, even as she held Nikolai's gaze a second too long, she could feel the weight of consequence settling upon her shoulders. The Tessarans would not let this stand. Nikolai seemed to sense it too, because as they took their final step, he murmured, "So, on a scale of 1 to full-blown intergalactic incident, how much trouble are we in?" Ira exhaled, glancing at the High Council members who were already beginning to rise, their expressions unreadable but their intent unmistakable. "I believe," she said calmly, "we are about to find out." Nikolai had always been good at making an impression, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident, and sometimes by tripping over his own feet in a high-stakes diplomatic setting. Tonight, however, he had truly outdone himself. The Tessaran High Council, a collection of regal figures clad in shimmering robes that seemed woven from liquid starlight, had risen in unison like some sort of synchronized judgment machine. Their elongated faces remained impassive, but their long, tapered fingers flexed ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible sign of disapproval. Nikolai glanced at Ira. "So, do we bow, salute, pretend we were never here?" Ira did not answer immediately, her golden eyes remaining locked on the council, her elegant posture betraying only the slightest tension. Finally, she exhaled. "Follow my lead." "That's what got us into trouble in the first place," Nikolai muttered. "Right, following." They turned as the High Council's leading figure, a tall, silver-skinned Tessaran with an air of perpetual disapproval, took a step forward. His name, as Nikolai recalled from his briefing notes, was Counselor Jezrin. He had the kind of presence that suggested he could silence a room just by clearing his throat. "Unprecedented," Jezrin intoned, his voice like a chime struck in deep space. "Never before has a Tessaran initiated an unstructured dance, much less with a—" His gaze flicked over Nikolai, human. Nikolai offered his most diplomatic smile. "I like to think of myself as a trailblazer." Silence. Ira resisted the urge to sigh. "The human did not act alone," she said firmly. "I extended the invitation, he merely accepted." "You misunderstand," another council member said, their voice equally serene yet filled with quiet dismay. "It is not merely the act of dancing, it is the nature of the dance, unstructured, undirected, improvised." The word was spoken like it carried a disease. "You introduced chaos into harmony." Nikolai furrowed his brow. "I think that's a bit dramatic. I've seen chaos. There was a nightclub on Vega Prime where the drinks were sentient. Now that was chaos. This," he gestured vaguely, "this was just a little unplanned fun." A horrified murmur rippled through the assembly. Ira pinched the bridge of her nose. "Nikolai, I don't think." "Fun," Jezrin repeated, as if he were testing the weight of the word in his mouth and finding it deeply offensive. "Yeah, you know, fun, enjoyment." The thing that happens when people aren't constantly worried about being the perfect embodiment of cosmic grace. More murmuring. Ira was fairly certain someone in the back was about to faint. Jezrin's expression remained unreadable, though his fingers twitched again. Such concepts are unnecessary. Our existence is one of balance. Perfection is our joy. Nikolai crossed his arms. I don't know, man. I saw a guy over there clutching his ceremonial sash thing like he just witnessed a crime. If everyone's so joyful, why does everyone look like they just bit into a lemon? Ira had to admit he had a point. Tesseran society thrived on the illusion of contentment, but that illusion was precisely what had made her feel so alien among her own people. It was why she had reached out, why she had extended her hand. Jezrin turned to her now. Ira, do you understand the weight of your actions? Ira lifted her chin. Yes, and I do not regret them. The murmurs grew louder. Jezrin's gaze darkened ever so slightly. Then you leave us little choice. At his signal, a pair of robed figures stepped forward, their eyes impassive but their presence unmistakable. Tesseran sentinels, enforcers of order. Nikolai tensed. Okay, I've seen this movie before. This is the part where we come quietly and then bad things happen. Ira's ears twitched. We have not yet been charged. Oh, great. That makes this feel so much better. Jezrin raised a single hand and the sentinels halted. You will not be imprisoned, he said smoothly, but you will be evaluated. Nikolai frowned. That sounds ominous. It is an opportunity, Jezrin corrected, to prove that you are not beyond redemption. Ira narrowed her eyes. You mean conformity. Jezrin didn't deny it. Nikolai sighed. I'm guessing skipping town isn't an option. The sentinels took a measured step forward. Yeah, okay, got it, no skipping. They were escorted from the grand hall not in shackles, but in something equally oppressive, the weight of 1,000 silent gazes. The walk through Tesseract's illuminated corridors felt like moving through a cathedral of judgment, and Nikolai could feel the scrutiny pressing against his back. So, he muttered as they passed through a pair of gracefully arching doors, when you said, follow my lead, did you mean walk straight into a bureaucratic nightmare? Ira gave him a sidelong glance. I did not anticipate this outcome. That makes two of us. They were led into a vast chamber unlike the grand hall, darker, more intimate, its walls pulsing with shifting glyphs of unknown meaning. A figure awaited them there, seated in a floating chair that defied gravity as lazily as a cat in the sun. They were older, their silver skin etched with faint bioluminescent lines that pulsed in time with their breath. The elder regarded them for a long moment before speaking. You seek meaning beyond what is given to you, they said, their voice softer than the High Council's but no less commanding. You challenge the fabric of what is known. Ira did not look away. Is that a crime? The elder smiled faintly. Perhaps not, but it is dangerous. Nikolai, sensing a shift in the mood, cleared his throat. So, what happens now? The elder tilted their head. Now you learn or you fail. Nikolai exchanged a look with Ira. That's vague. Yes, the elder said, and just like that, the doors behind them slid shut. The room was eerily quiet save for the soft hum of the floating chair where the elder remained seated, watching them with an expression that was equal parts amusement and scrutiny. The walls shimmered with shifting glyphs, casting rippling patterns of light across Ira's face. Nikolai, for his part, tried very hard not to think about the fact that they were now officially under evaluation, which sounded suspiciously like probation with extra judgment. He scratched the back of his head. Okay, so when you say learn or fail, is that like a study guide? Or is this more of a figure it out as you go and hope you don't get vaporized kind of thing? The elder's bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly. No one will be vaporized. Nikolai exhaled in relief. Oh, good. Unless, of course, you choose poorly. He blinked. Wait, what? Ira, meanwhile, had adopted her usual air of cool defiance. This is unnecessary. The Council's concern is tradition, not truth. They fear what they do not understand. The elder tilted their head. And do you understand what you have done? Ira met their gaze unflinchingly. I danced. The elder smiled slightly. Yes, you did. Nikolai glanced between them. I'm getting the sense that dance means more here than it does at, say, a wedding reception. The elder gestured to the glyphs on the walls, which flickered in response. The Tesseract way is harmony, precision, a unity of purpose. Our dance is more than movement, it is order, structure. It reflects the alignment of the cosmos itself. Nikolai frowned, and we messed that up. Ira's voice was cool. We did something different. The elder nodded, and different is disruptive. Nikolai sighed. Look, I'm not saying I'm against cosmic order, but can we agree that maybe a little disruption isn't the end of the universe? The elder regarded him for a long moment. Then they reached out a single hand. The glyphs across the wall shifted, rearranging into a complex series of interlocking symbols. Dance, they said. Ira's ears twitched. Excuse me. The elder gestured again. Show me what you did, what you defied. Nikolai hesitated. You want us to dance here, now? The elder inclined their head. Nikolai turned to Ira. This feels like a setup. It is, she agreed. They stood there unmoving while the glyphs pulsed around them. Then Ira let out a slow breath. Fine. She stepped forward, extending her hand as she had done before. Nikolai, still not entirely sure how this had become his life, took it. The moment their hands met, the room responded. The walls darkened and the glyphs swirled outward, creating the illusion of infinite space. Stars flickered in the distance, forming constellations that moved in time with their breath. Nikolai swallowed. Oh, okay, that's new. Ira ignored him. She guided him into the first steps, the fluid, sweeping movements of Tesseract tradition. But she did not stay within its boundaries. She led him into the improvisation, the unexpected flourishes, the unchoreographed moments of human instinct. The stars around them pulsed brighter. The elder watched in silence. Then something changed. The stars flickered erratically, shifting in ways that defied the graceful patterns of the Tesseract cosmos. The constellations distorted, twisting into unfamiliar alignments. Ira faltered slightly, sensing the shift. Nikolai, however, had a different reaction. Oh, he muttered, that's unsettling. The elder made a soft sound, perhaps amusement, perhaps something else entirely. Fascinating. Ira's brow furrowed. What is happening? The elder gestured, and the shifting stars around them froze in place. You have done what no Tesseract has ever attempted. You have reshaped the dance, and in doing so, you have reshaped the pattern. Nikolai glanced at Ira. Is this a good thing, or a we accidentally broke reality thing? The elder's gaze was unreadable. That depends. Ira straightened. On what? The elder's markings pulsed once more. On whether you can control what you have created. Nikolai let out a nervous chuckle. No pressure or anything. The elder rose from their floating seat, their movements impossibly smooth. You are not being punished, they said, stepping toward them. You are being tested. Ira narrowed her eyes. Tested for what? The elder did not answer immediately. Instead, they gestured once more, and the frozen stars began to move again, but not as before. Now they moved in response to Ira and Nikolai. When Ira lifted her hand, the stars followed. When Nikolai took a step, the constellations rippled in time with him. Nikolai let out a slow breath. Okay, that's, definitely new. Ira looked at the elder sharply. What is this? The elder's smile was almost imperceptible. An awakening. Nikolai frowned. Of what? The elder's voice was quiet, yet it filled the space. Of possibility. Nikolai had experienced his fair share of weird moments in life. Once, he'd been stuck in a malfunctioning zero-G bathroom on a starship for 3 hours. Another time, he'd accidentally walked into an in-species diplomatic meeting wearing what he later discovered was a ceremonial funeral robe. But standing in a room where the stars moved when he did, that was a new one. So, just to recap, he said cautiously, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, watching a cluster of stars ripple outward in response. We're somehow influencing space itself just by dancing. Not space itself, the elder corrected, its reflection. Beyond the patterns, Nikolai had a habit of getting into situations that spiraled wildly beyond his control. It was practically his brand at this point. But standing before the Tesseran Council again, this time with Ira at his side, felt less like an escalating disaster and more like willingly poking a beehive just to see what would happen. Ira was, as always, composed. Her golden eyes held no fear, no hesitation. If anything, she looked almost amused, which was probably the most unsettling part of all this. Meanwhile, Nikolai stood next to her, shifting his weight awkwardly and wondering if there was an appropriate way to wave at the deeply unimpressed group of high-ranking aliens staring down at them. So, he said, clearing his throat, nice to see everyone again. Love what you've done with the place. Very grand. The chamber was, in fact, grand. Towering columns of crystalline material stretched up into a ceiling so high it was barely visible. The floor beneath them was some kind of reflective surface, which gave the unsettling impression that they were floating in an endless abyss. One of the council members, an elder Tesseran with a face like a perpetually disapproving librarian, leaned forward. You return. Ira inclined her head. We do. The council member studied her, then Nikolai, with something bordering on open distaste. You defied the rhythm. You disrupted the pattern. Nikolai scratched his chin. Okay, but in our defense, we did it beautifully. Ira shot him a look, but he could have sworn he saw the faintest twitch of amusement at the corner of her lips. Another council member, this one slightly younger but no less judgmental, gestured to the space around them. The shimmering walls shifted, forming intricate moving glyphs in the air. You do not understand what you risk. Ira straightened. Enlighten us. Nikolai sighed. And here I was hoping we could just get a stern lecture and be on our way. The council ignored him. Instead, the glyphs in the air pulsed brighter, forming an interconnected web of shifting energy. The Tesserans have existed in harmony for millennia, the first council member intoned. Our dance is balance, our rhythm the pulse of the cosmos itself. To disrupt it is to court chaos. Nikolai crossed his arms. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? The second council member fixed him with a sharp gaze. Is it? And then the glyphs changed. Where once they had been stable, predictable, now they trembled, shifting unpredictably. The colors warped, the patterns fractured, the chamber itself felt off, like the universe had developed a slight but noticeable limp. Nikolai blinked. Okay, I see your point. Ira remained unimpressed. The cosmos is not so fragile that a single dance can unmake it. The first council member's eyes narrowed. You are arrogant. I am correct. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Nikolai sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, if the concern here is that we're causing instability or breaking reality or whatever, wouldn't it make more sense to figure out what's actually happening instead of just yelling at us? A murmur ran through the council. The first council member looked even more annoyed than before, which Nikolai hadn't actually thought was possible. You are an outsider, they said at last. You do not understand our ways. Nikolai shrugged. That's fair, but if your ways don't leave room for change, isn't that a problem? The murmuring grew louder. The council did not like that question. Ira, however, smiled faintly. The human is right. Nikolai blinked. Wait, can you say that again? Maybe louder. I want to cherish this moment. Ira ignored him, stepping forward. You believe our dance is fixed, immutable, but the universe is not. It expands, it shifts, it grows. If we do not adapt, we will stagnate. The second council member frowned. You speak recklessly. I speak truth. The council chamber fell silent again, the tension palpable. Nikolai could almost feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down, resisting the very idea of change. It reminded him, oddly enough, of his first diplomatic mission, a negotiation with the Arcturans Synod over interstellar flight paths. They'd refused to adjust their sacred navigation routes by even a fraction of a degree, even when presented with evidence of a dangerous stellar anomaly directly in their path. Old habits weren't just hard to break, Sometimes they were downright suicidal. Jezrin, who had been watching the exchange with cold calculation, finally spoke. Perhaps no one dared to dance with her. Then a human stepped forward.